Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey, welcome back to the I Thought You'd Like to Know show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. I have an absolutely great conversation for you coming up that was done with my longtime friend, Pete Graler. And we actually met in Catholic school. And part of the reason I wanted to talk to Pete is he is somebody who I see as a very successful cradle Catholic. And I wanted to get his perspective on why he felt he was not only able to retain his faith as he got older, but even strengthen it and develop it, which is in stark contrast to my own personal journey, where I fell away for many, many years and then had to completely rediscover Catholicism and its riches and beauty. So as somebody with children, I really wanted to know what were all the factors that pressed in on Pete's development that really helped him to not only, again, retain his faith, but even strengthen it in periods of doubt and frustration and questioning. And then the conversation naturally evolved into some of the problems that are getting fairly explicit in higher education these days, and Pete and I share a number of our experiences there, and how the Catholic Church yet again can provide some solid ground, some really fundamental solutions to what seems to be a multiplicity of philosophical problems. So I thought that this was an absolutely great conversation. Again, as somebody who is a parent now of 3 kids, it is of increasing importance to me to make sure that they are raised confidently Catholic, that they understand their faith, and that they too are able to strengthen their convictions along the way. So I'm glad Pete got to join me, and I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I had in having it. All right, folks, have fun with this one.
We were talking privately earlier. I had a morality class my sophomore year that, they asked the age-old question of, you're on a sinking ship and you're kind of on the door like Rose in Titanic, and you can only save either your drowning dog, which you've known most of your life, has been a great companion for you, or you can save this stranger that's drowning, a foot away from you. And I have to say, without hesitation, that 95% of the class chose to save their dog. And wading through those situations like you were talking about is, you had a falling away. And got to give credit to my mother again. We went to retreats when we were in high school, away for a weekend to deepen our faith. And I have an analogy that's always kind of stuck with me, is we're all just ships kind of caught in a storm on the sea, right? And it's in those waves where we have our doubts, right? And this priest taught this to us at the retreats, is if you go just merely beneath the surface, like you talked about, a lot of people don't want to question a lot. If you go just beneath the surface, there's calm, there's quiet. People are hesitant to dive deeper into their faith. And I guess, all through these 12 years of parochial education, then I decided, I'm going to go to a state college, because number one, I can't afford to go to the private college, and number two, they didn't necessarily have the kind of clout that I was looking for in a degree, so to speak, from a state school. And that's when it all started going haywire.
Yeah, so let's get into that, because I know something that has been the topic for a lot of our conversations is we both had very similar experiences in college. We were honestly alarmed, and I was alarmed even as, I would say, a secularist at this point, at just how incoherent some of the philosophies were that were being taught. I was very disenfranchised by my college experience, extremely disappointed. And we'll get into my story a little bit here too. Is I actually ended up leaving college with one class left to take. So I was majoring in economics and finance, but I also started my own business in college. Things went in such a direction that I was able to sufficiently support myself, and I was so turned off from the education, quote unquote, that I was getting at the college. I said, you know what? I want to leave here. I want to make a point. I want to make a point to millennials, to people in upcoming generations. You do not need a college degree to be successful. And I think I more or less successfully made that point. But now I'm back in college for the reason that I have an opportunity to do some graduate programs, so I needed to wrap that up. And the experience is even more terrifying now, even more alarming now than it was back then. And I say this before, and I hope that nobody, accuses me of being insincere. You hear of all these kind of nutty things happening in academia these days, and you want to take them with a grain of salt, which I always did. I always figure, okay, this can't be that bad. There can't be professors actually teaching these kinds of crazy relativistic things, which is what we're going to get into. And then, irony of ironies, I think I get like the sample of relativism, like the acme of relativistic type of professors. There are no objective truths, there are no objective moral values. This is an ethics class, by the way. And this kind of started the conversation we're having now, and lo and behold, you had very similar experiences in your college education. And this is coming from a Catholic background. Again, I was coming from a secular, more public school background. I had definitely gone away from the faith at this point. I was just so alarmed and confused by what was actually being taught. Again, not in all my classes, not even most, but enough of them. So let's go into your experience a little bit, because you majored in literature, correct? English, yep. Yeah. So take us through that journey a little bit. What were some of the things that you ran into and that really jarred you a little bit?
Well, I initially went into college wanting to be an English teacher, but I had always been someone who was in love with the story. Mm-hmm. There's a lot to be said with the creation of fairy tales and plays like Shakespeare and works like Dostoevsky and C.S. Lewis, the great Christian apologist. Mm-hmm. J.R.R. Tolkien, who through his many doubts with the faith, wrote one of the best trilogies ever and convinced C.S. Lewis to come back into the fold. Mm-hmm. I've learned all this through my own research, by the way.
Oh, yes. I very much doubt that they would have taught you that at a secular university or exposed you to Lewis, which is a shame. I mean, Lewis is one of the greatest writers to ever live. And I never even discovered Lewis until I already began reinvestigating Catholicism mm-hmm. and Christianity. He was never somebody that was talked about through my experience, anyways. Mm-hmm. So, anyways, continue.
Yeah, I found a lot of this through my own experience, and coming out of a parochial school, I was immediately almost ostracized in some of these classes. Going to humanities especially is where you see a lot of this relativism creeping in. It's like we have to get to the antidote to really put the poison in, so to speak. And I feel like, we can discuss this further later, but the humanities especially, and the studying of the philosophies, are really the answer to this. All of this relativism and the loss of God in education, and even the agnosticism that maybe was once education that now has to be totally thrust out. And in going through this education, going in, loving the story, loving people like George MacDonald, Back to the North Wind, kind of old school fairy tales that talked about afterlife and the idea of God and the idea of something more. You know, I got into my Shakespeare class. I've always loved Shakespeare. One of the greatest canonical writers. He actually steered me into a classical literature emphasis. In my last 2 semesters in college, I read The Canterbury Tales, Paradise Lost, and Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, all in 2 semesters, which was a lot. But, you know, seeing that and seeing these works that were on high, and then all they try to do is tear down the morality, the universal truths that are trying to be taught in all of these works. Like, take Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, for example, where he writes one of the greatest villains in all of literature, which is Shylock, you know, the moneylender. And what came out of that was an idea that Shakespeare is profoundly racist because he cast this anti-Semitic eye on Shylock for making him this villain in all of this. Shakespeare is an imperialist because, you know, they have to all go to the land to find out where Portia is, and they, you know, put all their ideas into this, you know, this rude colonizing. And it just teared away at, you know, the moral fabric that I thought. And then when you live on campus especially, every aspect of your life has to be torn down into these, well, it's not your truth, but you better accept it because it's somebody else's.
Yeah, the relativist thing, and anybody who's listened to this show before, my podcast on the Pat Flynn Show, knows that I am no advocate of relativism on any degree. Moral philosophy became a specialty of mine for many years, and, you know, mostly a personal interest, and I never thought that it would pay off, but it has, big time, in many ways, because I've been well equipped to deal with this problem of relativism, that there are no objective truths. And I think the first thing that people should realize about relativism is that it's ironically self-refuting. It would be self-referentially incoherent, as we would say. Because to say that there are no objective truths is to make a claim of at least one objective truth, that there are no objective truths.
Isn't that the irony, though?
Well, that's, you know, again, it's we would say that this is self-referentially incoherent. The entire notion refutes itself. So you're either stuck in this position of admitting that we know absolutely nothing, which would include the truth of relativism, so you have to undermine it there, or that we know at least some things, and therefore there are truths to be discovered. So the philosophy is bankrupt from the absolute beginning. But then when it comes to applying these things to this relativistic postmodernist ideology to literature or morality, I think it becomes, if not destructive, dangerous. I mean, literature is just a series of absurdities, one after the other. I mean, are you really here's a contradiction, Pete, that I think is very funny, because on the one hand, you know, you should be able to interpret a book however you want. You should be able to interpret Shakespeare however you want. But on the other hand, they're actively trying to throw him out of academia, it seems. So why are we doing this? I mean, why not just reinterpret him according to whatever your truths or values happen to be at the time? Why the need to thrust him out? Right? Well, it seems like probably because deep down they know that he's speaking to some things that are actually objectively true that they don't agree with.
Right. Well, I'll hearken back to literature in this, in that, you know, I need something to stand on here. But G.K. Chesterton once said, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in nothing. You will believe anything. And one of the postmodern concepts, especially in education, is you need to get rid of God forthright. And that's where you can start having these arguments that there is no objective truth. And, you know, at least in my studies and probably in yours too, this type of moral relativism leads towards nihilism and a strict a strict selfishness, let's call it, in that it either leads to the nihilism that says, that's absolutist, that says, you know, none of my decisions matter and therefore how can life have any meaning? Or it leads essentially to the butterfly effect that says every decision that I make, you know, from the batting of my eyelash to how much water I drink a day, has infinite effects throughout space and time. And I think neither of those is a great way to live your life.
Well, so just to be very clear here, nihilism should be the result of relativism, which is the almost inevitable result of atheism, right? So if you're an atheist, and unfortunately I have to keep repeating this as much as it continues to upset my atheist friends, you should be a nihilist. And this is something that I presented in the ethics class, and I told you that I gave the kind of the final speech in that class, which was an argument in defense of objective morality, which was aired or will be aired on this radio station if anybody wants to hear my presentation there. I absolutely brought God right back into the classroom where he belongs. But the point is if atheism is true, then we have thrown out teleology. We have thrown out any possibility of objective meaning, value, purpose, or significance in life. If all life is just happenstance, and all we are slightly more evolved primates, hurling through space on an infinitesimal speck of dust, doomed to utter oblivion. The universe is running out of energy, right? At some point, matter will collapse, life will be completely snuffed out. Nothing we do will make any ultimate difference in the end, right? And when you contemplate this, you realize, oh shoot, I might as well be a nihilist.
Right.
And, you know, to the extent that people don't contemplate it and are atheists, that's fine, but they're just not living consistently with their philosophy. So there's the contradiction here is that to the extent that you're an atheist and living consistently, you should not be happy, at least not if you're a sane person, because no sane person can live happily without a sense of meaning in life, right?
Right.
But to the extent you hold on to a sense of meaning, you have not lived consistently with your philosophy. Relativism is even more confused and even more absurd, because if you're a naturalist atheist on one hand and you're a relativist on others, then you would believe that all beliefs essentially are the offshoot of deterministic evolutionary processes, right? They're not guided whatever. So you should have no confidence that any of your beliefs are true, right? There's no basis for rationality on this worldview. It's just, that's just what happens to be your belief. But that also includes the belief in evolution, naturalism, relativism. You have undermined everything that you believe in by asserting that you believe in this philosophy. You cannot even get it off the ground to begin with. So, so you can't. I can't help but laugh at the absurdity of these philosophies, because they rebel against everything that we know is obvious and is true. Any argument you can give for relativism is just so easily overwhelmed by the obviousness that, hey, 2 + 2 really does equal 4. There are such things in this world that are truly right and truly wrong, right? I do have a head. Any argument you can give against me not having a head is going to be inherently weaker than the immediately properly basic belief that I do have a head. And all this was kind of included and developed in the speech I gave in this ethics class, to which I was ready and eager for a debate with this relativistic professor, and nothing was offered. So I don't know if that, I don't know what that says, either about me being rigorous or her not being prepared. I can't tell you, but it really is. And I remember talking with a few mentors before this and say, hey, you know, a few years ago when I really started first tackling this problem, I asked them, like, this philosophy seems absolutely absurd. Is it really as silly as it seems? Like, I'm trying to think of different angles here of ways people could defend this, and I don't know what to think. And one of my mentors was like, no, it really is that easy. It really is that stupid.
It's a cop-out.
Fundamentally, it's just that incoherent. Yet it persists. And it doesn't only persist, but it seems to even grow. Now, thankfully, the research shows that most professors are not relativists. Even the atheist professors, I don't think most of them, at least the ethics one from the research I've shown, are not relativists. But again, and Pete, I know we were talking about this before, is because some people will say, well, it's not most, so it's not a problem. But give me a break. Like, how many do you need before this is a problem? I think one is a problem. You bring somebody into a class, right? And you tell them that there are no truly right and wrong things in this world, that there is no moral difference between the people who suffered in the Holocaust and the people who conducted the Holocaust. You try and teach people that's acceptable, even if it's just one instance, which it's not.
Right.
But even if it was just one, why aren't we talking about this? Why isn't this making bigger news? Maybe because it fits within a certain political ideology, which it certainly does, but if it was on the other end of the spectrum, then there would be nothing but sheer outrage. And, Pete, it frustrates me to no end, but I'm lucky to have had the opportunity to go back in at a later age after I've really developed knowledge and skill in this area, and to be able to face it head on. And after I gave my speech, the students came up and they thanked me, because the class, they said, did nothing but confuse them the entire semester, and I was able to bring a certain amount of clarity by establishing the ontological basis for objective right and wrong, for truth, which of course is God, but I gave what I thought were some pretty convincing philosophical arguments for these foundations. And again, I don't think any of the kids were really going along with it to begin with, but they were definitely not satisfied with what was being taught. They were being confused by it, and so it was very rewarding to me at the end when I finally got to, I was just waiting for this day to come that I could get up there and give my presentation to be able to deliver that to him. So I went off on a huge tangent there. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
Yeah, we see this especially in the humanities too, and just in education as a whole. Getting back to what Chesterton said, if you don't believe in God, you don't believe in nothing. We've so supplanted God in education that we have two gods now, at least in my perspective. One is tolerance, the other is inclusion. Mm-hmm. And that's what's creating our hierarchy now. You said, a lot of educational institutions are getting rid of these people, especially from a relativist view. How can you say one is more valid than the other? And I think that comes down to, who they think is quote-unquote woke enough to, be called into, we should learn more of this than you should of this, because we have to be tolerant now. There's, God only knows how many genders on the spectrum now, and, it's just creating more confusion than anything else, like you talked about. And I think that part of that is it comes down to, you want to trust who's giving you this information, but if you really step back and look at it, and you talked about coming into it from having outside experiences, a lot of these kids in this class, and correct me if I'm wrong, they went from grade school to high school into college, and they've never really had to question why things are the way that they are.
Yeah, well, a few of them, most of them were exactly that. They were early college students. A few were returning later in life. They were coming out of the military or what have you. But none of them had any sort of background in philosophy to begin with.
Right.
And we wonder why people think or accuse philosophy of being worthless. Well, when this is the kind of philosophy that's being taught, it's worse than worthless. It's dangerous.
It's inclusion philosophy.
It's idiotic. And the very funny thing about, the tolerance doctrine, and look, I'm a fan of tolerance in the right proportion to other virtues.
Oh, absolutely.
Of course. But you can't support it on relativism, because you have no basis for objective moral values. You have no foundation to say that tolerance is any more right than being intolerant. Right? So again, we have a performance contradiction of what you claim to believe on one hand and how you act on another hand. And this was pretty, performance contradiction is pretty much a word I would use to sum up my professor in this class's philosophy with everything she did or taught, because she was a strong moral relativist. And when I say strong moral relativist, I mean that she not only believed that there are no truly right and truly wrong in the world, that there is no moral difference between the person committing a crime and the person who is a victim of that crime. So she said that on one hand. She took it a step further and would also say that because of this, moral values should not be taught. A person's moral character or behavior should not be instructed, criticized. People should not be praised, blamed. So forget all of the radical implications that would have on society, which is just completely impossible to even comprehend. But then she was herself an advocate for many certain particular causes. So we have on one hand,
ironic?
Yeah, isn't that ironic, right? So one completely,
there's no truth except my truth, I guess.
So what do you do when you go to champion these causes? And the causes are irrelevant. We don't even have to bring them up. But does she just say that she just happens to like them, and that's why she supports them? The answer is obviously not. She believes that these causes are just or right or worth fighting for, or that trying to work for some type of fair play or whatever you have. So I'm sure that she will bring in this sense of objectivity when it's convenient, but then she'll completely toss it away whenever it's time to teach philosophy.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you talked about teleology too, which for anyone that's listening that doesn't know what teleology is, it's what comes of the reasoning at the end. We've gotten so rid of consequences, and I think that's kind of where we're kind of circling around right now, is you can have these musings, especially in an educational setting, without lack of any consequence, and people are going to believe you, especially if you have X, Y, Z, and PhD behind your name. But where there's this endless loop of relativism, right? You can't ever get to the end because essentially nothing's true, so everything's true maybe, or some things are true.
What I want to be true is true.
What I want to be true is true. And
I just want to pause right here and remind
end.
folks that are listening, like, this is being taught in school, in higher education. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, this is silly, this is absurd, I swear to you, this is not an exaggeration. Again, I will gladly happily admit that this is not most professors, but it is at least some, and it seems to be particularly prevalent in the humanities departments. Things like anthropology, philosophy has definitely seen a surge of this for quite some time. Again, I think it remains in the minority, but it's not an insignificant minority. So these things are being taught. Right. They are being propagated. So if this is alarming to you, which I think as a Catholic it should be terrifying. Just I guess be careful where you send your kids to school, right?
Right.
And Pete brought up the idea of teleology, or directedness, that things are for certain things. If you go back to Aristotle's four causes, he had efficient cause. What is something made of? A formal cause. What is the form of a thing, the shape of a thing, like the bed of a river, for example. What is its material cause? What is it made of? And then what is its final cause? And that is the teleology. What is it for? So the teleology of a saw is, of course, to saw. A saw is most a saw when it's sawing. And you're right there. It was the sort of throwing away of teleology in certain philosophies that really at least lended to, if did not directly result in the rise of relativism. But you can't get rid. And fortunately, teleology has seen a strong resurgence. It's lagging for what it should be. But with recent discoveries like the fine-tuning of the universe, for example, to see that the universe just is just so precisely dialed in for the emergence of intelligent life, that that those constants and quantities just balance on just the thinnest of a razor's edge is amazing. This has led, rightfully so, to a resurgence in certain teleological discussions in philosophy and science, rightfully so, because it's there. It does exist. Right. But it was, at least in one part, the sort of throwing away of teleology. And the history of philosophy is very interesting to me because you can see where a lot of these wrong turns were made, specifically after somebody like Thomas Aquinas and the Enlightenment and things. And it was held on to for a long time, but it has just been this kind of slow deterioration of logic, reason, common sense, of this abandonment of properly basic beliefs, of things that are overwhelmingly true in our experience that we have no good reason to get rid of. And, a lot of it, too, has to do with certain political ideologies trying to be backed in right, into academia. And we need a certain philosophical foundation like postmodernism or relativism to support or substantiate these certain political ideologies. But it's an amazingly complex web of absurdities. The more I dig into it and the more I discover it. I'm not ready to make any predictions. I hope that the culture is changing, that there's a shift being made. It seems like that the people are becoming more aware of this. And again, I was extremely surprised myself because I didn't discount the stories that I heard, but I took them with a certain dose of what I thought was healthy skepticism, saying, it can't be this bad or whatever. And it was, Pete, my experience was the most absurd thing you could imagine. If somebody,
mine as well.
If somebody told this to me, I would accuse them of being insincere. I would have been, no, it's not that bad. It's only because I experienced this myself that I believe it. I don't even expect other people to believe it. I posted on Facebook, and then I'll shut up and let you talk for a while, that famous conversation I had with my professor after she outlined, I say famous, it did get passed around quite a bit. She outlined her strong moral relativist philosophy, and of course I pressed back on it and wouldn't let this go in class, as speaking up and whatever. I always try to be polite, right? I don't think it's worth, being a stinker. You can make a point civilly, but you can make it firmly as well, which I tried to do. So after class, she calls me up and she's like, hey, I'd like to challenge you and suggest, maybe don't talk up as much in class and give other people, a chance to participate. So I said to her, naturally, I said, Professor, are you trying to, critique my values and my behavior? She said, no, not necessarily. Let's just remember that we're part of a community or whatever. But I said, well, what if I don't value?
It was her best way of shouting you down.
Well, yeah, what if I don't value the community, Professor? You just said that we shouldn't try to critique, praise, blame, criticize people's other values. We should just let them discover themselves, right? So what if I don't value the community? She says, well, I think you do value the community. Well, who are you to tell me what my values are? You just said this is exactly what we should do.
The moral relativist trying to tell you about values.
Falling right into the trap that she herself set. And again, it could not have been more deliciously ironic. You would think that I would have had to have invent this, but I couldn't invent it. It was too good to invent. It actually happened, and I left that class thinking, wow, that actually really did just happen. Like the most absurd, contradictory thing that could possibly be imagined was actualized. And that is a summary, a short summary of how this semester went for me. But back to you, Pete. Draw upon your experience a little bit more.
Right. I can talk on my experiences too, especially towards the end of my fabled career in the humanities. It used to be, you got a little bit of everything. You got, the Beowulfs of the world, and then into, the medieval works like your Canterbury Tales and things like that. Towards the end of that, you got, Shakespeare and Milton talking about Paradise Lost. Maybe I was actually fortunate enough for me able to get some Aquinas. There was one professor at my school that I credit for, helping me through wading through this pool of moral relativism that speaks on the same topic we're talking about, Dr. Duke Pesta. If you ever get a chance to talk to him, I would highly recommend it. And then, part of your capstone your junior year is you have to write literary criticism, so to speak, and that's where you're encouraged to write they call them lenses on which to evaluate a work. And by the way, reader response is kind of what you got out of a work is a lens, but they kind of don't want you to use that one really. Although that was always the one that I used because I never liked any of these other ones. There's looking through the lens of gender. How does the author deal with things like possible, LGBTQ issues in the 16th century? Go figure. Marxism, Shakespeare's such a bad author because, all they're doing is holding down, Shylock and, the Capulets and the Montagues are very well off, so of course they're going to fight. It's that kind of absurdity that absolutely drove me up a wall. And that's where, I forget the author's name, but he wrote a book called The Story Killers, just on this topic alone of how they've absolutely gutted the humanities and now use them to push this sort of postmodernist ideology and relativism and things like that. And they've essentially turned the idea of a higher being onto oneself. You know, I can be God now. You know, that's Nietzsche's classic saying, God is dead. You know, the Ubermensch, the Ultraman, right? I can rise to the level of making my own self God. And it's just, it constantly wears away at these young 18, 19, up to 23-year-old minds, in that we talked about teleology, and I think some of that, especially in our age now, looking back, you say, you know, why do I think the way I think? And I think that is what's going to lead a generation back towards Catholicism, or, you know, coming through agnosticism and back towards the idea of an organized religion. Because, you know, I look at something like biology. You know, they've gotten rid of, you know, the intelligent designer, and it's been replaced by evolution and things. And I remember sitting in a classroom learning where all of this life, all of life in big air quotes, is coming from. And I said, really? Primordial soup? Like a bunch of cells got together and all of a sudden created this grand monstrosity we now know as the planet Earth, floating on some space rock that, you know, is the perfect environment for us, not too hot, not too cold. And that's where I think, especially for me, you know, we talked about my doubts earlier, that's where I started clawing my way back towards Catholicism, is asking those kind of questions. And I fell back into, you know, what do I do best? I read literature for a 5-year, 4-year degree, right? And, you know, Dostoevsky makes an incredible argument for the value of human life, especially in Crime and Punishment, and the brothers Karamazov arguing for the idea of God. And that's where a lot of my understanding now has kind of come from.
So that's good, because you know, even though the secular university experience would often try to dispel people of the notion of God, it was through these great classic works that your faith was actually reinforced in a lot of ways. That's awesome. That's really good. And then, just because you brought up the biology note, I would recommend people go back and listen to my interview with Dr. Gerard Verschuren, who is himself a biologist and geneticist, and just a top-notch scholar and scientist, where we kind of discussed that question in some very fascinating and good detail. And believe me, he, as should rightfully be the case, there is no conflict between religion and science, or God and evolution. You just need to understand the relationship properly. So for anybody who's interested in that topic, go back, listen to that episode I did with Dr. Verschuren, and it was absolutely fascinating, and can help if anybody's struggling with that issue. You know, here's somebody who is just, you know, is as high as it gets in the world of biology and genetics. So if he is able to reconcile the two, that's all. You know, for me, it was never an issue, because when you look at the fine-tuning of the universe, that solves the question of evolution to begin with, right? The initial conditions for human life were set there necessarily. So whether the evolution process was further guided or not, it was at least initially guided, and that's all you need for the teleological argument to take off, which again is part of the reason why I think it has seen such a strong resurgence, is with these recent discoveries in modern cosmology and so on and so forth. So the other point you brought up, Pete, that I think is an interesting one, and that leaves me optimistic, is that the more obscure and absurd these philosophies become, and the more contradictions they run into, and the more confused they leave students, I think the more students will go on a hunt for an alternative, for something that is a lot more rational and sane. And to the extent that they are willing to keep an open mind, I think they will find those foundations very solidly and firmly in the Catholic faith, and I certainly did. And again, it goes back to the idea of, people question, but you can't. It's not enough to question and doubt. Look for the answers. Study the great, rich intellectual tradition that is just all throughout the church history, from the early church fathers right on down to the contemporaries of today. That was kind of the initial lure that brought me back into Catholicism, is just seeing how Catholicism offered absolutely consistent and satisfying answers for all the biggest questions in life. Origin, meaning, morality, destiny, the consistency of the philosophy, the objectivity of it. Just beautiful and thorough and so incredibly helpful, and it's something that I have made a personal mission of mine to try and champion and promote, to see maybe if we could save people from the struggles that I had to go through and the confusion that I had to go through, which brings back to the original point that we were talking about of why I'm interested. Okay, what made you a successful cradle Catholic? And again, I think periods of doubt and questioning are useful. They make you look for answers. They make you better understand the faith.
Absolutely.
But too many people fall completely away because they don't have enough of an understanding, or they get challenged at the university or level, and they just don't know how to respond. Now, part of that, I think, is kind of the dropping of the apologetics component for the past number of decades, but fortunately that's coming back. Apologetics is on the rise again, it seems, very strongly, so that'll be reconciled. But going back to you, Pete, and your experience as somebody who has, again, been able to strengthen and deepen your cradle Catholicism, what are your thoughts on this?
Right. While you were talking, something occurred to me, and we talked about questioning, and the Bible itself says, Christ says himself, "Let the children come to me." And you can attest as a father of 3 children, what's the most common question you get asked? Why?
Mm-hmm.
And I think, and they talk about this in classic literature all the time. There's me going back to it again. But that sense of wonder, in Paradise Lost, Milton talks about the sounds of the spears, the angels, the dominions singing praise to God. And he talks about Adam and Eve being able to hear this angelic music as the world goes around. And when they're cast out of Eden, they can't hear that anymore. They're not in tune with what's going on around them, and they're not. So we have to ask this why, And I think that's where, science and the humanities and things start running into trouble, especially for people like you and me, as we start asking, why? And I think that's what's, especially for me, leading me back to an understanding of God and what faith means, because you talked about doubt, and I think faith is doubt. We don't know what's in the great beyond and beyond this mortal coil and things like that. And, Captain Hook once asked Peter Pan, are you afraid of death, Peter? He said, no, death is but the next great adventure. Yeah. And I think that, when it comes to relativism and things like that, it's what a horrible life. I'm going to live till I'm dead, and there's nothing beyond that, and there's no truth. Well, if I live for everything, do I die for nothing?
Well, then, enter in the age of nihilism, as we were hinting at before. A few points that you brought up that I think are worth drawing out. Faith is doubt. Yeah, faith definitely has doubt. But to me, faith has to mean something like trusting in that which you have good reason to believe.
Right.
I think a lot of people confuse faith, especially now, and thanks in no small part to a lot of polemic new atheists who are just deeply confused on the topic of religion, confuse faith with credulity or gullibility. And if that's how you're defining faith, then yeah, I'm against that too. That's no good. That won't cut it. Faith has to be trusting in that which you have good reason to believe. We have very good reasons for thinking that theism is true, that God exists. We don't have anywhere close to equally comparable reasons to thinking that atheism is true.
Right.
I will take up that debate any day of the week with any atheist. Same thing. We have good reasons to believe in the historical facts concerning Jesus and his resurrection. We have good reasons to believe in that. And since we have good reasons to believe in that, we have good reasons to believe in the things that Christ taught and said and did. Can we prove them beyond all doubt? No. That's why doubt exists. But that helps to substantiate the faith. That helps to build the trust, which is part of God's mission, is to have you freely come into a loving, saving relationship with him, which makes perfect sense then that he would allow for elements of doubt, for that trust factor to be developed and to be built, which is, of course, I think, an extremely honorable virtue and something worth developing. The other thing is the why question, and somebody sent me a video not long ago, I think it was like Ricky Gervais, who is annoying in his ignorance. Beyond almost anybody out there today in the promotion of atheism. I think it was with Stephen Colbert, who I'm no great fan of either, but I think he does at least try to defend the Catholic faith sometimes, even though I think he's kind of brings it out when it's convenient, puts it away when it's inconvenient. Said, well, what about why? Why does something exist rather than nothing? And Gervais responded with the comment, oh, don't ask why questions. It's about how. No. These are both equally good questions. And here atheists accuse religious people of being intellectually lazy, right? Here you're writing off the most exquisite question of all, that Leibniz said, this is the most exquisite question that any person could ask. This is the first question any person should ask. Why is there something rather than nothing? To ask how is a question of etiology, of how one physical state led to another. That's a great question, right? And we have sciences to try and figure out answers to that. But the why question, the ontological question, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is it that the universe seems utterly contingent? Things come into being, they pass away, they do not explain themselves. Anything in the universe does not explain itself. It has a superficial contingency. The universe as a whole seems to have a radical contingency. It could have been different than it is. It could have had different laws, different fundamental stuff. It doesn't have to exist. So why does it exist? It seems like that God really wanted us to ask these types of questions. So to just write them off because you've adopted a particular worldview that you really have no good reason to adopt, that you will but will defend come hell or high water, to write off the most exquisite and beautiful and important questions of life. And talk about a travesty. Because there is a meaning to life, right? But to adopt a worldview and go through life and miss that meaning, just because you were so dogmatically tied to your atheism or secularism, there could be no greater tragedy than that. The point I guess I would like to make is, if there is a meaning to life, no matter if you're on the fence or you're an agnostic, if there is a meaning to life, there could be no greater tragedy than to miss what that meaning is. So I think everybody owes it to themselves to at least try to ask these questions. And Pete, you nailed it right on the head when you say, what is the question kids ask? Why? It's not what. It's not how. I'm not saying those questions aren't important. Why? Why is this? Why is that? Why, just why everything incessantly? Obviously, we're programmed to ask these questions. The human mind wants to know, as Lonergan said, everything about everything. God put that into us for a reason, to help develop the relationship with him. So we have a few final minutes here, Big Pete. Any last points you want to make or draw on this absurdity of relativism?
Yeah, like we've been saying, this can either lead you into an incredible sense of nihilism, that nothing matters and I'm just an ant on this rock willing to run headlong into the abyss, and what comes of it. They talk about Pascal's wager as an answer to relativism. It's okay to live as a relativist, but maybe you should say a prayer every once in a while just in case there is a God, so maybe you can save your soul if necessary. Like we were talking about, this is turning into an epidemic in education, coming from a guy that has quote unquote a worthless degree in the humanities. I have to I have to thank my love for reading and literature for helping me, come full circle. I was in college, not going to church, wondering what I'm doing here. What purpose do I have in life? I'm still struggling to find answers to a lot of these questions, but like we said during the talk, you can always come back to the church. And as I grow older and question the faith and read the teachings of the church, the great encyclicals by John Paul II about, I'm a married man now, Humani Vitae, on human life, why the church talks about, not using birth control methods, the value of human life, bringing life into my household eventually with my loving wife who might be listening, and there's an answer if you look for it. But I think where relativism and postmodernism creeps up is we want to live a life without having to do a whole lot of work. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I'll kind of finish with this, is in my conversations with my friends over the weekend, and this commonly gets brought up, is, hey, Pat, since becoming a Catholic, did your life get any easier? And I say yes and no. Yes, that it's given me such a greater sense, it's returned me to the sense of meaning that I was meant to have. And so to that extent, all my troubles and burdens have been enormously lightened. But no, in the sense that it calls you to such a higher standard, right? The Catholic faith is one that sets an extremely high bar for people, and most people fail. But the church realizes that, so it has an extremely high bar for redemption and mercy. Extremely high in its standards, extremely high in its mercy. And what a wonderful and beautiful thing, and something that's been consistent in my life is, hey, you don't need to lower the bar for people. Keep it high, help people clear the bar. But also be quick to forgive yourself when you don't quite make it, which all of us fail. All of us are prone to make mistakes. But like you said, Pete, no matter how many mistakes you've made, no matter how long you've been away, you can always come back to the Catholic Church. That redemption is always there. That reconciliation is always there. God wants you to do it. Jesus wants you to do it. So if you're listening to this and you've thought, like, what, I need that foundation of support, you can always come back to the Catholic Church. So we'll end it there. Pete, thank you so much for joining me.
All right, thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.